Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and my co-host Robert Brandt and I are joined today by Anne-Raphaëlle Audouin, CEO of Nukik Corporation, the 100% Inuit-owned developer behind Canada's most ambitious Arctic infrastructure project. The territory of Nunavut is 20% of Canada's landmass. It has few roads, no transmission lines, and no physical connection to the rest of the nation. Every community, every hospital, every school, and every mine runs entirely on diesel. 138 million liters of it, imported almost entirely from foreign countries every single year. Anne-Raphaëlle joined Nukik in 2022 to lead the strategic Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Linkis, a $3 billion, 1,000-kilometer transmission line that would connect the Kivalliq region to the continental grid for the very first time. In our conversation, you'll discover why Nunavut's infrastructure deficit is a political problem, not an engineering problem. You'll also learn how Nukik became the first Arctic electricity developer in North America to be certified by the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, formally establishing Nunavut's pathway to the continental North American grid, and understand why the Inuit communities this project will serve are not waiting patiently. They are telling Nukik to stop presenting and start building. So, Anne-Raphaëlle, welcome to our podcast today. Rob and I are very pleased to have you join Drumbeats to hear about what Nukik and your team there is up to, because it's very exciting news.
Yeah, and Raphael, thanks for joining us and taking the time to talk about your big project.
Thanks for having me.
So, as you know, our listeners are mostly in the UK and continental Europe. So we would love for you to introduce the corporation a little bit. Some of them may not have heard of it, and tell us a little about yourself and about the Inuit ownership structure, and of course about the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Linkis that you're trying to achieve. And of course, the Arctic's on the radar these days. So that's great.
Yes, absolutely. So look, I'll start by describing a bit of our work in the Arctic, and then narrow it down to the project. I think it's important to know that the Nunavut Arctic is very different from any other Arctic regions that you could work in, that you could live in the rest of the world. Canada, despite having the second largest Arctic border in the world, really hasn't developed much of its Arctic over the years. So when you look at countries like maybe Sweden, Finland, or Russia, they have very developed infrastructure well past the Arctic Circle. Whereas if you look at a Canadian map and you consider what's been built, especially Nunavut, it's really zero. So very important to understand that Nunavut is 20% of Canada's landmass. It's a huge jurisdiction. It's Canada's largest jurisdiction. And yet it's completely isolated. So there's no road, there's no transmission line, no bridge connecting Nunavut to the rest of the nation. Now, you can imagine what that creates. It hinders progress. It hinders commercial development, social ties. It doesn't bring, this territory into the societal and economic makeup of the country. And also, it has just kept the territory behind in terms of accessing very basic infrastructure services. So that is the lay of the land. Now, Canada, in terms of its jurisdictions, there are provinces and there are territories. Territories are a bit different than provinces in the sense that they come with a bigger responsibility for the federal government. And so the way we approach a project like the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Linkis is really to say that this is akin to a public service type of project because and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but because of the population base, which is not very large, and the high capital cost of any infrastructure build out in that region, you really have to have a strong participation from the federal government. And that is a key piece of the puzzle in understanding how we work in the Arctic, is to understand that we have to work very much in lockstep with the Canadian federal government. Now, Nukik Corporation was formed in 2021, so it's maturing, but it's still a young entity. It was created by the Kivalliq Inuit Association, which is the elected government body of that region of Nunavut. There are 3 regions in Nunavut, which have their own elected governments and their associated development corporations, which are essentially the business development arms of those Inuit associations. So in 2021, the Kivalliq Inuit Association realized that they just could not lead a project of the scale and size of the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link on their own. And they needed to incorporate with everything that entails and would open in terms of opportunities and reach, etc. So Nukik Corporation was created at that time under 100% Inuit ownership. So the Kivalliq Inuit Association owns 51% of Nukik, and then their development corporation, Saku Investments Corporation, owns 49% of Nukik. And that's the beating heart of the organization that I'm the CEO of. That's the beating heart of the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link, because every decision that we make is guided by our board of directors, which is made up of Inuk from the Kivalliq region. And they hold that vision, they give us direction, they advise us as any board. And that's what's been, the constitution really of the organization, but also what's taken the project to this stage now, which is active development.
Thank you for that. Can you just go back and explain about the establishment of Nunavut? Because one of the reasons, when we talk about the underdevelopment that's taking place, which is, just absolutely terrible when we hear about this. And you're right, because living over here, when I think of northern nations, historically, I've never thought of Canada as a northern country. You think of the Scandinavian countries, Norway, because they live and breathe. Most Canadians don't live and breathe it, and these issues come up, and it's a disgrace, the state of the territory when it was handed over. But can you talk a bit about the establishment of that?
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? And not all of it is fascinating for good reasons, as you said, but we have to acknowledge it. And I think, again, to go back to what I said earlier, it is very unique what's happened in Nunavut, both in terms of its creation, but also how young the territory is. So maybe, a good place to start is just, the 50s and what happened, because I work in the energy space and telecommunication space. And that's when a lot of those systems were actually, implemented and delivered into those communities. So essentially, and I'm for the sake of time, I'm really going to simplify what happened, but people need to understand that this is a long written history that has spanned really multiple centuries, taken us to this stage now. But in the 50s and 60s, the federal government essentially colonized the Arctic, and to assert Arctic sovereignty relied on the few people that were living there. However, Inuit people by tradition and by culture were nomadic people. And so they could not be, quote unquote, relied on to assert Arctic sovereignty at a given spot. And so what happened at the time was quite terrible, because the federal government of those days, in some cases, created artificial settlements, artificial hamlets, and to keep Inuit people in those settlements, they took away their dogs, which were their traditional ways of, going around, following the caribou herds, hunting, going fishing in the springtime and summertime. They took and slaughtered those dogs so that Inuit people could not exercise their nomadic lifestyle anymore, and they would essentially be landlocked, which worked. People stayed, people created lives, had children in those settlements, and they are now, those 25 hamlets that we know of in Nunavut. And some are historic, settlements that were used on a rotating basis during the seasons. Some were created during the 50s and 60s mining activities, and some were purely artificial, again, because of what happened with colonization. And this is well documented. This is something fairly tragic, clearly, that's happened. And the second part of that story is once you tell people that they have to stay in a given place, you have to give them the basic ways to survive, right? And so when Inuit people were nomadic, they would, as we all know, live in igloos in the winter times, under, tents in the summertime. Very harsh living conditions, but they were very resilient people, and they had lived there for millennia, so they knew their way around. Once they had to be in those hamlets and stay there, obviously lifestyle changed, and so the federal government gave them diesel plants. At the time, the decision was not made to connect them to any kind of infrastructure because distances were far and long in between. Cost was already a consideration. And also, if you consider a hamlet like Ranking Inlet, that's now close to 5,000 people on the west shore of the Hudson Bay. In the 50s or 60s, it was probably 500 people. So the analysis of the cost benefit was, as you can imagine, people just decided at the time that it was not worth it to create and extend grid connection, road connection, the basic infrastructure that would keep people there. So they did the bare minimum. And that bare minimum was to provide diesel engines that in some communities are still the ones that are being used now, right? So they've been overhauled a few times, refurbished a few times, but they are, first of all, in the center of those hamlets. Diesel plants in Nunavut are not a few kilometers away from downtown. They are your direct neighbor. I live in Ranking Inlet myself, and I see the fumes from the diesel plants. That's the first thing I see every morning when I open my curtains. And that's the first thing we smell in the air when we go outside. That's the very real reality of living in the Arctic. And obviously, I think we all know that in 1999, the territory reached, the territory of Nunavut was created. And so it's adolescent still. Up until 1999, it was under the Northwest Territories. And so the Northwest Territories Power Corporation was managing those assets. Jurisdictionally, it was one extremely large territory. And then it was split in two with NWT, and then the creation of Nunavut, as I said, in 1999. It's still maturing through a lot of its own legislation. Devolution, as we know, is now happening. And I think it's really ripe for a major economic boom, just due to the sheer population growth. Nunavut has one of the youngest population in the whole of Canada. Some hamlets actually in Nunavut have the youngest population in the whole of Canada. And culturally, in terms of their abilities also, it's very rich. It just has a lot to contribute to our Canadian economy. Now, what's keeping it behind is the lack of infrastructure.
Well, thank you for that background, which I think is very helpful. And it talks about the economic opportunity that's now in front of everyone, all Canadians, because the Arctic, we've got here for the wrong reasons. But now that we're here with people like you and the organizations, the Inuit organizations behind and what needs to be done, there's a huge opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And Anne-Raphaëlle, I'm interested in your story too. How long have you been involved? And what's your background? How did you get to be working in Canada's far north with the Inuit as you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like any career, you happenstance to a degree, and then being at the right time in the right place. I'm an environmental, legal specialist by background, and specialized in natural resources management. So started my career working in the mining sector in the field in Western Africa, and worked on a variety of projects. And then worked in the hydropower sector for quite a few years. I represented the National Industry Association that represents all of the hydropower generators in Canada and their suppliers of goods and services. And then I think I just wanted, to really touch and feel a project, because when you're a consultant or when you're on a large scope of the advisory services, you do get to work on very exciting undertakings, but it goes very fast and it's never yours to lead from cradle to gate. And so I had this opportunity to work on the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link. I joined the organization in 2022. And I will say it's like moving a big boulder up a mountain to move big projects like that, because it's a 3 billion capital cost project. It's a 1,000 kilometer transmission line that we're trying to build in a region where Canada is a bit of a mental block when it comes to building in that region. And I also completely overhauled the corporation so that we have 3 distinct divisions now looking after the different services that we want to offer, from generation, transmission, and energy consulting services. So it's been busy, but I'll tell you, I think it's what's really exciting, and maybe it's a call for action for young professionals who are looking for exciting areas of work, and also geographically. It's one of those areas, and maybe one of those last places in the world, where it's a blank piece of paper. Everything needs to be invented, from roads to transmission networks to probably working on legislation and supporting Inuit in maturing through that new ownership and territory that has been created just 25 years ago. So there's still a lot of work to be done in supporting them. And I find that that's very satisfying intellectually, but also on a personal level, you feel like you're contributing a little drop in that ocean, and it's always something that in a career is motivating.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you've been involved in the far north even before it was cool to be involved in the far north as it does today.
It's always cool, Rob.
Yeah, no, I think I caught that train at the right moment before, a certain president in the US started, claiming ownership stakes over the Arctic far and wide. And it's definitely talked about a lot now. I mean, all of us in Nunavut really say that it's long overdue in terms of paying attention. And quite frankly as well, the amount that it's being talked about is still nowhere near what's required in terms of realizing that it's a critical part of this country, making sure Canadians understand and know about Nunavut. Very few people know that the statistics I gave you, right? Like 3 different regions, 3 different time zones in Nunavut, created in 1999. The possibilities, the fact that it's completely isolated. There's a Nunavut 101 that is missing from the Canadian curriculum that I hope is my work, other people's work is gonna start emulating a bit.
Yes. And coming back to the diesel, with 140 million, I think, liters of diesel, and it's all imported?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Staggering. When I started working on the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link, we didn't have a lot of data because, again, the project was still fairly new. It had been pushed at some points by the federal government, at other points by the province of Manitoba, other times by the territory of Nunavut. But really, it was articulated around the idea of becoming connected and that almost romanticized idea of being part of the country. And then when I came on board, I really identified that we needed to drill into the numbers. We really needed to understand what vulnerabilities we had, what opportunities were associated with those, and how we could leverage our strength. And so that 138 million liters of diesel fuel that is being shipped and barged into the Kivalliq region every year is very real, and it's going up and up and up. Because what you have to realize is that specific region is very active in terms of industrial development. So there are 2 active mines that burn more than the entire region together. And there's no other way to bring fuel into the Arctic than by barge. And so you have to imagine those ships coming in as soon as the ice melts in June up until early October. And just the it's a ecological catastrophe waiting to happen. I think it's a small miracle that nothing on a large scale has ever happened. And I fully realize that a degree of diesel shipment will always need to happen in the Arctic, because you will always need diesel for backup generation up until a point where maybe you have backup local baseload generation. But at least for the next few decades, it's still going to need to happen. But there are very real pathways to reduce that risk, and to not only reduce the risk, but also create new economic opportunities for the region. So that is one key motivating factor for all of us, is to reduce the amount of diesel that's burnt in Nunavut. And one other key statistic that we find out really as we started working on the project, we reached out to the government of Nunavut, their petroleum products division, and we asked the origin of that diesel. And we were expecting it to be mostly Canadian. But the numbers came back that most years it's 100% of all the diesel that we burn that comes from foreign countries, mostly the US. So not only do we burn diesel for every single part of our lives in Nunavut, but it's not even Canadian diesel. And then because I work on telecommunication as well, because the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link would bring also fiber optic, we also got data on how we support telecommunications. And it's mostly all supported by Starlink right now, which is amazing technology. It works really well. It has transformed the way we can do business. Just over the last 3 years, I've seen it's night and day in terms of connectivity. So we welcome it. But the problem is it's not Canadian technology. So you really have, into such a strategic region, an enormous Achilles heel. You're heading into a wall with no optionality, because optionality takes a long time and it takes large investments. And so a project such as the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link would create a domestically owned and operated infrastructure backbone into that strategic region of the Nunavut Arctic. And it's not going to resolve everything on its own, but it's a critical piece of putting all of those foundational blocks together.
That is fascinating. But when you talk about those risks, forget who it is. It's not Canadian, and the federal government's eyes have been closed, who've been responsible for the territory, and those who vote them in haven't raised these issues. But when you think of the risk that now comes to fruit in this world that we live in, we have given effective control to non-Canadians, whether the diesels come from New Zealand or America, it doesn't make a difference. We're not in control. And given how much Canada is defined by the North, geographically, in terms of size of territory, we don't have the right military presence, we don't have the right infrastructure, and huge challenges and opportunities in front of us. That's a fascinating background.
Yeah, and I think it's what you realize as well. And look, we could go pretty deep in that rabbit hole in terms of the shortfallings of some of those decisions over the years. But once you give away those pieces of sovereignty, it's very hard to reclaim it. And that's what every day I'm confronted with, just pushing that project forward. And I know that there are other people in Nunavut and elsewhere in the other territories trying to move very worthy projects forward. And what we are faced with is really the fact that it becomes status quo, right? It becomes the fait accompli, the way things are, and why change them, because it's humming and puffing, but it's working, right? And then people do the math and they're like, okay, for our project, for example, 3 billion capex for 16,000 people. It's difficult to justify. So you really have to understand it for all the things that you've said, which is it has to be driven by a bigger aspiration to really reclaim who we are, which is we are an Arctic nation. We're not just neighbors to an Arctic nation. We're not just going there for research and sending a few, museum, northern ecologists to, walk on the tundra every summertime. This should be something. Yeah, but there's so much more to it, and people are calling for this kind of infrastructure. And that's the other piece maybe that I should highlight is because of the Inuit ownership, you couldn't hope for a better social license. People want this infrastructure. There will be probably, a stop on the road where they say no more mining, or we don't want this infrastructure here or there when, I'm talking in 20, 30, 40 years. But the markers right now are very much connect us to the continental grid, which Nukik has done. We have a MISO certification. We are the first and only Arctic electricity developer to have been certified by a regional transmission organization in the US, which is a major, major accomplishment. And we're ready to go. So the communities, every time we go in and we do our community engagement tours, communities tell us to not come back until we've actually started building something. They're getting frustrated with us for not, going faster and delivering this asset. Where else in Canada do you have this, right? Like that's the other piece of the puzzle that it needs to be reconciled is you really have a jurisdiction that is going to welcome you with open arms, and yet you cannot bring yourself as a country to do it.
Right. So just to interrupt there for a second, that MISO certification is equivalent over here, I understand, to the ENSO-E technical certification for interconnector projects between the UK and continental Europe. So it's very similar in terms of what has been achieved. But you're right, it's a huge opportunity. Let's get a little bit into the detail of the project, but I have this question, and this is not one of the key projects that has been identified yet for
Correct.
the National Projects Office to get. What is the background to that? Why not? I mean, you're not the person to be asking that. That should be going to the Prime Minister and his team.
Yeah.
Because this seems to hit all the right markers.
Yeah, you're going to get me in trouble here, Mark, by becoming a bit political in my statements, but it remains to be seen with the major project office, right? Like I think the government is still new. It's going on its first birthday, meaning the Mark Carney government. And within the first few months of his new government, he implemented and launched the Build Canada Act and then the major project office. And the idea, again, for maybe listeners who are not in Canada or may not know the context, Mark Carney really identified that Canada was very bureaucracy heavy in its process for major projects, be it pipelines, be it railway, be it transmission lines, local generation, etc. We were just not efficient. Despite having all the resources and all the brain power, we could not get those over the finish line. So he created the MPO stating that he would fast track projects that were deemed to be in the national interest. That identification of being in the national interest is based on 5 criteria. Some of them are, have to benefit Indigenous communities, has to benefit climate, has to be obviously in the national interest of the country from a sovereignty and national security perspective, and a couple others. When the legislation came out, I think we probably were one of the first proponents to write to Prime Minister Carney and say, bingo, we meet and exceed every one of those 5 criteria. And I was quite happy to see that happen because I had been for years calling out the federal government for the red tape that it was putting project proponents under. And the fact that, again, despite having all of the cards in hand, we could not play and win that game, right? We were just standing in our own way, which is something that a lot of observers and a lot of people are saying about Canada. And then we didn't hear anything, but we saw the projects being listed and referred to the major project office while we were just standing by and hoping to be housed under this new system, which is really the way I view it. It's, at the end of the day, it might still be a new bureaucracy reframed and relabeled, but I see it as a house where you can have a whole of government approach and really have experts, financial, energy experts, looking at your project and telling you, okay, this is how we're going to crack the code on making it happen, especially in the Arctic. They're so complex. And we're still in that, dance, I would say, with the federal government where they're trying to see how such an undertaking could go. If we were $500 million type of project, we would already have been referred. So I'm just telling you a little secret here, but it's 100% because of the capex. And until we find a way to get those major projects done under what I said, at the beginning of the call, under public service framework, and stop analyzing them as having to have an economic backbone of their own, which they never will. They're never going to be economical on their own, just because there aren't the rate base in Nunavut is 40,000 people. How are you going to justify the multi-billion dollars worth of investment that's required to bring those people the level of infrastructure that they deserve? It's just not going to work. So until you have leaders who accept that, just accepting it, then you can have the creative thinking and the wheels in motion to say, okay, well, we are going to do green bonds. We are going to do, social credits. We are going to do all of these things that are in the toolbox that Canada never really leveraged on international platforms, but that international investors would be very interested in if there was the backstopping of the federal government. So the last thing I'll say is the federal government is very good at asking proponents to have skin in the game. They're not very good at putting their own skin in the game. And so time will tell if they're putting their, if they're walking the talk.
Thank you to Anne-Raphaëlle Audouin for sharing her insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.